Hello, welcome to the next reading from A. Skevington Wood's Wesley Evangelist. Today is chapter 15, The Many-Headed Beast. Why it's entitled that I don't know. We've still got 3 chapters left in part 2. And this is about 9 pages long. They all are, about 9 or 10. So, from the second part of the journal, page 395. Well, I was enforcing that great question with an eye to the spiritual resurrection. Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you that God should raise the dead? The many-headed beast began to roar again. I again proclaimed deliverance to the captives, and their deep attention showed that the words sent to them did not return empty. So far we have only hinted in passing at the opposition Wesley met. Now we must consider it more fully. It was hardly to be expected that such an aggressive work for God would be allowed to go on unhindered. At the outset, Wesley encountered resistance within the church. This was what drove him into the open air. But even there he was not left undisturbed. Indeed, especially in the early years, there were many adversaries. He seems to have anticipated this and accepted it as an inevitable accompaniment of effective evangelism. Such is the general method of God's providence, he wrote, where all approve, few profit, from the journal, 14th of December 1772. He was thinking in that instance about those who rejected his message because it was so uncompromising, and for this very reason others were impressed by it. But the same principle obtained when disapproval exhibited itself in something more than closed ears and hardened hearts. There were times when hostility to the gospel led to violent mass attacks on Wesley and his colleagues. Wesley frequently referred to these uncontrolled mobs as the beasts of the people or the sons of Belial. He mentions this on 26th of January 1742, 27th of March 1764, 5th of June 1765, 19th of October 1769, 7th of May 1742 and 1st of April 1750. And where that Belial comes from, Wesley is no doubt recalling Paul's allusion to fighting with beasts at Ephesus in 1 Corinthians 15:32 and the several Old Testament references to the sons of Belial. In the journal entry for the 26th of October 1740, where he spoke about the many-headed beast, it would appear that he was personifying the vicious crowd as a single entity under the direction of Satan himself. In other cases, he alluded to a rude rout on the 9th of January 1742, abundance of rabble, 25th of September 1746, and those possessed by Moloch, 24th of April 1752. If this sounds strong language, it must be recollected that the 18th century mob was a terrible phenomenon. No one knew that better than Wesley, for he had to face it perhaps more often than any man of his time. He earned the right to comment by the hard way of experience. It must not be imagined that only the Methodists were the victims of such violence in this period, says Outler in a book we've already mentioned, and Max Beloff's Public Order and Popular Disturbances 1660 to 1714, which was published in 1938. It presents a revealing account of the general unrest in the period before Wesley. The mob was a persistent and violent element in the Georgian scene, explains S.E. Ayling. And in an age whose characteristic freedom was underlined by its almost total absence of police, a riot was never far below the political surface. There were pro-Jacobite riots in 1715, anti-Jewish riots in 1753, anti-Catholic riots in 1780, and anti-Methodist riots on numerous occasions. Riots against Walpole and his Excise Bill in 1733, riots in Edinburgh in 1736 against the hanging of convicted smugglers, riots in London against the attempt to regulate gin drinking in 1736, riots arising out of the imposition of turnpike tolls or import duties, or from taxes on Scottish beer, or the introduction of labour-saving machinery, or industrial strikes, or unpopular wage fixing, or parliamentary elections, or 101 matters great and small. Horace Walpole wrote ironically of our supreme governors, the mob, and Henry Fielding referred to it as the Fourth Estate, along with King, Lords and Commons, from the letters of Horace Walpole, Volume 1, which was published in 1903. He wrote to Sir Horace Mann on the 7th of September 1743, and you can also see that in the works of Henry Fielding, published in 1882, which was edited by Leslie Stephen. In Smollett's Humphrey Clinker, 1771, the testy Squire Matthew Bramble depicts the mob as a monster I never could abide, either in its head, tail, midriff, or members. I detest the whole of it as a mass of ignorance, presumption, malice, and brutality. From his book, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, which was published in 1966. Thus, Tobias G. Smollett's The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. It is understandable that this many-headed beast was profoundly feared, he wrote on the 26th of October 1740. It was made up from the dregs of society and constituted a constant menace. Most of the cities and larger towns were threatened by such a mob, as Wesley discovered to his cost. The most serious opposition was raised in Staffordshire. Wednesbury was the centre. Wesley arrived there on the 20th of October 1743. There had been anti-Methodist riots earlier in the year, but he had not been present. He preached at noon in the High Bullen on Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever. That's Hebrews 13, verse 8. I believe every one present felt the power of God, he declared, and no creature offered to molest us, either going or coming, but the Lord fought for us, and we held our peace. This, however, proved to be the lull before the storm. Wesley was attending to his correspondence in Francis Ward's house in the afternoon when the mob surrounded the building. Inside, the Christians knelt in prayer. The crowd left, but then returned with reinforcements. They demanded that Wesley should come out to them. Instead, he invited the ringleader inside, and very soon had won him over. Some Wednesbury men then undertook to escort Wesley as he went to visit the Justice of the Peace to claim protection. Unfortunately, the magistrate was in bed and refused to get up to intervene. It was decided to seek out Mr. Justice Pesshouse at Walsall. He likewise declined to assist. At this point, the Walsall mob set on one whom they regarded as an intruder. The men from Wednesbury tried to screen him in vain. That Wesley escaped with his life was nothing less than a miracle. As he was carried through the town, successive cries were raised of "drown him," "hang him," and even "crucify him." Some shouted, "Strip him, tear off his clothes," to which he mildly answered, "That you need not do. I will give you my clothes if you want them." In the intervals of tumult, wrote Charles Wesley later in his journal, Volume 1, he spoke, the brethren assured me, with as much composure and correctness as he used to do in their societies. The spirit of glory rested upon him. As many as he spoke to, or but laid his hands on, he turned into friends. He did not wonder, as he himself told me, that the martyrs should feel no pain in the flames, for none of their blows hurt him, although one was so violent as to make his nose and mouth gush with blood. Eventually he was rescued by the man who had led the mob, "Sir, I will spend my life for you," he said. "Follow me, and not one soul here shall touch a hair of your head." He lifted Wesley on his shoulders and waded through the river to safety. The evangelist reached Wednesbury, having lost only a flap of his waistcoat and a little skin from one of his hands. Looking back on his adventures, he exclaimed in his journal for 20th of October 1743, "I never saw such a chain of providences before. So many convincing proofs that the hand of God is on every person and thing, overruling all as it seemeth him good." It was certainly a night to be remembered. It confirmed Wesley's sense of destiny. He knew that only God could have preserved him, and that this was for his purpose. Perhaps the most touching incident of all was when a rough lout came rushing at the preacher with his arm raised to strike. Suddenly he let it drop, and only stroked Wesley's head, saying, "What soft hair he has." That's from the same day in the journal, 20th of October 1743. This was by no means the only time Wesley was in danger of losing his life. Both at Bolton and at Rochdale the stones flew plentifully, but whilst they damaged some of the other assailants, Wesley himself was untouched. At Hull, clods and stones were hurled on every side without harming him. He had difficulty in reaching his coach afterwards, however, and then found that the driver had thought it safer to quit the scene. However, he was offered a seat in another coach, where he was amply protected from the missiles by a large gentlewoman who deposited herself in his lap. That's 24th of April 1752. At Falmouth, the house where he was staying was beset on all sides by an innumerable multitude of people. A louder or more confused noise could hardly be at the taking of a city by storm, 4th of July 1745. The rabble roared, "Bring out the canorum! Where is the canorum?" This was a term used to denote a Methodist in Cornwall, and it may have been derived from the Cornish canor, a singer, and thus be connected with the Methodist love of singing. Wesley faced the mob alone when they broke down the door and rushed into the room. "Here I am," he coolly announced. "Which of you has anything to say to me? To which of you have I done any wrong? To you? Or you? Or you?" He went on speaking until he came bareheaded, so that all might see his face into the street. There he continued to pacify the angry crowd until he was rescued by the local clergyman, one of the aldermen, and some gentlemen of the town. It was Wesley's rule, confirmed by long experience, always to look a mob in the face, and he wrote that on 6th of August 1746. His frankness, his poise, and his unruffled speech went far to quench inflamed passions and to bring the rabble under control. It was his superb courage and composure, combined with his evident good humour and friendliness to all, which finally overcame even the bestial savagery of the 18th century mob. Wesley the Evangelist was a man possessed of amazing grace, comments Dr. Breedy. Never did he lose his temper, and always was he prepared to endure a blow if the dealing of it would relieve the hysteria of the assailant. Repeatedly, when struck by a stone or a cudgel, he quietly wiped away the blood, and went on preaching without so much as a frown on his face. He loved his enemies, and do what they would, they could not make him discourteous or angry. From the journal, 12th of September 1742. Wesley was wise enough, however, not to court trouble unnecessarily. He arrived in Pocklington on a fair day in the spring of 1752. The unusual bitterness of several who met him in the street gave warning of what might follow. A yard which was suggested as a preaching place seemed to be suitable save for one feature. It was plentifully furnished with stones, artillery ready at hand for the devil's drunken companions. That's 25th of April 1752. Just then it started to rain, so Wesley withdrew to a large barn and held his service in peace. Sometimes he abandoned the attempt to preach at all if it appeared to be lost labour. At Cowbridge, the sons of Belial gathered themselves together, headed by one or two wretches called gentlemen, and continued shouting, cursing, blaspheming, and throwing showers of stones almost without intermission, 7th of May 1743. After spending some time in prayer for them, Wesley deemed it best to dismiss the people. At Derby, interrupters lifted up their voice, hallooing and shouting on every side. That's the 27th of March 1764. Finding it impossible to make himself heard, Wesley walked unobtrusively away. An innumerable retinue followed him, but only a few pebbles were thrown. All kinds of diversions were introduced to distract the attention of the people from the word. Animals figure prominently in the accounts. At Charles Square in London, many of the rabble had brought an ox, which they were vehemently labouring to drive in among the people. But their labour was in vain, for in spite of them all, he ran round and round, one way and the other, and at length broke through the midst of them, clear away, leaving us calmly rejoicing and praising God. 12th of July 1741. At Pensford, a great company of rabble, hired for the purpose it turned out, brought a bull, which they had been baiting, and tried to force it into the congregation. But the beast was wiser than his drivers, and continually ran on one side of us or the other, while we quietly sang praise to God, and prayed for about an hour. The poor wretches, finding themselves disappointed, at length seized upon the bull, and by main strength partly dragged and partly thrust him in among the people. When they had forced their way to the little table on which I stood, they strove several times to throw it down by thrusting the helpless beast against it, who of himself stirred no more than the log of wood. I once or twice put aside his head with my hand, that the blood might not drop upon my clothes, intending to go on as soon as the hurry should be a little over. But, the table falling down, some of our friends caught me in their arms, and carried me right away on their shoulders, while the rabble wreaked their vengeance on the table, which they tore bit from bit. We went a little way off, where I finished my discourse without any noise or interruption. That's 19th of March 1742. At the great gardens in London, a herd of cows was used to create a disturbance, but once again without preventing the continuance of the meeting. 12th of September 1742. The mob did not always act on its own initiative. In some cases it was incited by Wesley's enemies amongst the gentry, and even, sadly enough, amongst the clergy. It was unquestionably the attitude of the clergy and of the landed classes which gave the mob its privilege and excuse, even when it was not led in person by gentlemen or curates, affirmed C.E. Villamy. Wesley was preaching once in Halifax when a gentleman got some of the rabble together and began to throw money amongst them, which not unnaturally caused quite a commotion. Finding that he could not compete with it, the evangelist led the people to a meadow about half a mile away, and there they concluded the service in peace. From the 22nd of August 1748. But the disturbances encouraged by the gentry were by no means all as mild as that. Some of the most violent assaults were incited by those of the upper classes. The Shrove Tuesday riots in Wednesbury in 1744 were deliberately provoked by mine owners who threatened to sack any collier who did not take part, 6th of February 1744. In Cornwall, some of the gentlemen magistrates set themselves against Wesley, and their hostility to him accounted for the attacks of the mob, 3rd of July 1745. There were occasions when the gentry intervened in person. At Gwenup, Wesley was reading his text when a gentleman, so called as Wesley invariably underlined, came riding into the thick of the crowd and seized 3 or 4 of the men. A second appeared on the scene and did the same. As the congregation started to sing a hymn, the leader, one Francis Beauchamp, later Sheriff of Cornwall, actually tried to lay hands on Wesley himself and impound him for the service of the crown. That's from the same day, 3rd of July 1745. At Bradford-on-Avon, the beasts of the people were tolerably quiet till I had nearly finished my sermon. They then lifted up their voice, especially one called a gentleman, who had filled his pocket with rotten eggs. But a young man, coming unawares, clapped his hands on each side and mashed them all at once. In an instant he was perfume all over, though it was not so sweet as balsam. 19th of October 1769. Wesley must have relished that case of the biter bit. At other times the gentry ordered their servants to break up the meeting. Coming to St. Ives in 1750 on the 23rd of August, Wesley was careful to seek permission from the mayor to preach in the marketplace. Despite this, he was rudely interrupted when the notorious John Stevens of Trafalgar sent his man to ride a horse to and fro through the midst of the congregation, and he was known locally as John a Court from his house. A famous man of the town, 24th of June 1745. Although some of the chief citizens urged him to continue and guaranteed protection, Wesley decided to transfer the service to the society room. But he saw good in this as in all things, adding, "Oh, the wisdom of God in permitting Satan to drive all these people together into a place where nothing diverted their attention." But his word had its full force upon their hearts. That's 23rd of August 1750. The persecution from the clergy must have been particularly hard for Wesley to bear. He sought to be a loyal churchman wherever this did not conflict with his conscientious convictions, or impede the work to which he was called by God. He genuinely loved his brethren in the ministry, and desired only to strengthen their hands where they were concerned for the kingdom. He must have been pained beyond measure when some of them turned against him and actually stirred up the mob. The most virulent of his clerical opponents was George White, incumbent at Colne in Lancashire. Tyerman dubbed him rather dramatically a popish renegado, because he was educated at Douai and intended for the Roman priesthood, from Tyerman's Life of John Wesley, Volume 2. In August 1748 he issued a proclamation to these terms: "Notice is hereby given that if any men be mindful to enlist into his Majesty's service under the command of the Reverend George White, Commander-in-Chief, and John Bannister, Lieutenant-General of his Majesty's forces for the defence of the Church of England, and the support of the manufactory in and about Colne, both of which are now in danger, let him now repair to the drumhead at the cross, where each man shall have a pint of ale for advance and other proper encouragements." From William Miles's book, The Life and Writings of the late Reverend William Grimshaw, published in 1806, and the proclamation was issued in August 1748. Shortly afterwards, Wesley came to preach nearby at Roughly with William Grimshaw. He was halfway through his message when the mob came pouring down the hill like a torrent. That's 25th of August 1748. They were armed with clubs and staves, and had evidently been plied with more than the promised pint of ale. That's in Volume 2 of his letters to James Hargrave, 26th of August 1748. Hargrave was the constable at Barrowford, and the letter is now thought to have been addressed to him and not to White as formerly supposed. Wesley was taken off to the constable at Barrowford, who tried to make him promise not to come to Roughly again. This, of course, he could not be persuaded to do, although he agreed to leave them without holding another meeting. Wesley was allowed to go with an assurance that the mob would be silenced. The constable spoke a few half-hearted words to them and disappeared. Wesley and his colleagues were left to their mercy. He himself was beaten to the ground, and when he attempted to get up, the whole horde made for him like lions. Grimshaw and Thomas Colbeck, a grocer from Keighley, were tossed to and fro, thrown down, and loaded with dirt and mire of every kind. William Macford, a trustee of the orphan house at Newcastle, was dragged about by the hair of his head, and all this time neither the constable nor those who had recruited the disreputable army lifted a finger to intervene. White soon drank himself first into jail and then to death. Another clerical inflamer of mobs was Dr. Walter Borlasse, aged 56 years vicar of Madron, the mother church of Penzance. As a magistrate, he harried the Methodist preachers relentlessly and refused their appeals for protection. One James Dale applied to him for redress after the mob had broken into his house and stolen some of his goods. "Thou conceited fellow," thundered Borlase, "what? Art thou too turned religious? They may burn thy house if they will, it is no concern of mine." From Villami's book. And Villami confused Dr. Walter Borlas with his distinguished brother Dr. William Borlas, the rector of Ludgvan and vicar of St. Just, the noted antiquarian and naturalist. Right. There is little doubt that the attitude of this scholarly yet unreasonable clergyman helped to provoke the anti-Methodist riots in Cornwall at the time. And when it says, "What art thou too turned religious?" you can also see about William Borlas in Joseph Foster's Alumni Oxoniensis. I don't know when that was published. At Buckland, near Frome, Wesley preached in a meadow owned by Jeremiah Emblem. The curate had provided a mob with horns and other things convenient to prevent the congregation's hearing me, but the better half of the mob soon left their fellows and listened with great attention. The rest did no harm, so that we had a comfortable opportunity. That's from 10th of September 1753. At Shepton Mallet, the incumbent had hired a silly man with a few other drunken champions to make a disturbance. Almost as soon as I began, they began screaming out a psalm, but our singing quickly swallowed up theirs. Soon after, their orator named a text, and as they termed it, preached a sermon. His attendants, meantime, being busy, not in hearing him, but in throwing stones and dirt at our brethren. This is 6th of August 1746, and in addition to the instances cited, it must be remembered that the worst persecution of all at Wednesbury was encouraged by the vicar Edward Eggington, and he wrote a letter about that to John Smith on the 25th of June 1746. It ought to be added, however, that in other places the local clergyman dissociated himself from the persecutions, even though he himself did not subscribe to Wesley's views. After the mob had pulled down the house where Wesley had preached on a previous visit to Chester, the vicar, John Baldwin, publicly expressed his regret on the 5th of July 1752. At Falmouth, as we have seen, it was a clergyman, Thomas by name, who came to Wesley's rescue on the 4th of July 1745. There were others whose position ought to have taught them better, who nevertheless joined in the fashionable pastime of baiting the Methodist evangelist. An attorney who happened to be in Heptonstall when Wesley was speaking there one evening endeavoured to interrupt by relating some low threadbare stories with a very audible voice, 8th of June 1752. He threatened to spoil the service with his interminable narratives. Eventually some of the earnest hearers cut him short in the midst by carrying him quietly away. We can imagine his discomfiture at being removed so unceremoniously, but he got no more than he deserved. At Taunton, Wesley planned to preach in the yard of the Three Cups, now the County Hotel, as it was at the time, but before he had even named his text, having uttered only 2 words, Jesus Christ, he was interrupted. A tradesman of the town, who turned out to be the mayor-elect, made such a commotion that in the end it was judged best to yield him the ground. Wesley led the people to a large room elsewhere, and there continued the service without further incident. That's 23rd of September 1743. Other individual disturbers of the peace of unspecified class are also mentioned. Some of them were quickly dealt with by the bystanders. At Newcastle-under-Lyme, one buffoon laboured much to interrupt, but as he was bawling with his mouth wide open, some arch boys gave him such a mouthful of dirt as quite satisfied him. That's 17th of March 1775. In some cases, though, those who came to scoff and make themselves a nuisance were strangely subdued. As Wesley came out to face a large congregation in the rain at St. Mirren, a huge man ran full tilt into him. He thought it was accidental until it happened a second time. Then the man began to curse and swear as he followed Wesley through the crowd. He planted himself right at the preacher's side. Wesley feared further outbursts, but as he proceeded with his sermon, his face grew serious, and he slipped off his hat. At the close, he squeezed Wesley earnestly by the hand, and went away as meek as a lamb. 6th of August 1750. Another big man appeared at Newark when Wesley was speaking in the covered shambles. He was exceedingly drunk and, as a result, very noisy and turbulent. It seemed that he might ruin the meeting, when his wife seized him by the collar, gave him 2 or 3 hearty boxes on the ears, and dragged him away like a calf. Eventually he eluded her, crept in among the people, and stood as quiet as could be. 12th of June 1760. That is reminiscent of an incident at Burnley, where the town crier began to bawl amain, which no doubt he could do with more volume than most. However, his wife got hold of him with one hand and clapped the other over his mouth, so that he could not give vent to another word. 13th of July 1784. Mob violence against Wesley seems to have been at its fiercest in England. Only occasionally do we read of attacks in Wales. At Llanershaimead, I apologise if I pronounced that wrong, in 1750, Wesley observed that he could just understand the oaths and curses which were in broad English, but the rest of the language was lost on him, as his was on them. There were several riots in Cork, but apart from that, Wesley was comparatively free from molestation in Ireland. It was a country he loved and which learned to love him. If we accept a few abnormal outbreaks accounted for by special incitement, claimed Kernock, Wesley was almost as immune from persecution in Ireland as in Scotland. In Scotland he was received with the utmost respect, though the response to his message disappointed him. All that was ever thrown at him there was a potato in Aberdeen on the 1st of May 1757. The most serious aspect of the mass onslaughts on Wesley was undoubtedly the fact that some of them were clearly organised. The gentry collaborated with the clergy in opposing a movement which they feared would upset the status quo. Their apprehension was justified to a certain extent, for the spread of the Christian gospel did more to emancipate the labouring classes than has been recognised by some materialistically conditioned sociologists. It is not difficult to understand why the mobs were often such pliant material in design in hands, writes Brian Greaves. They loved the loose living that the Methodists condemned. Many of their erstwhile comrades had deserted the tavern for the meeting house. There was abundant emotional energy in the 18th century, mobs which could easily be channeled. The chief reason, however, must be the economic dependence of the populace on the squarsons and the landed gentry in rural areas, and the industrialists who feared working-class unorthodoxy in the towns. That the landlords and the clergy were closely allied in the matter of persecuting the Methodists is beyond doubt, and one can perceive why this was especially so in 18th century England. The vestry was an important tool in persecution's hand. It was here that landlord and clergy, constable and alehouse keeper met to determine much that went on in 18th century England. One need hardly point out that here was a channel by which religious differences could be translated into physical force. And I'm just wondering what that came from. Don't know what proc means. I think it's from a work. Let's just see. PROC. I'm not sure what it is. It says Proc WHS Volume 31, page 111, but WHS. Let's just check the. Let's just check the names. WHS. I'm not sure who it could be. No, couldn't tell you what that is. So, unfortunately, I can't tell you, but it's volume 31 of Proc WHS, whatever that means. So, next week, God willing, chapter 16, Living Witnesses, will be the title of the next chapter, and incidentally, the reading material is 286 pages, and I'm on page 177, so we are halfway through the book. So until then, as always, may God bless you all. Amen.